Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in today. This presentation is about the first chapter of my dissertation research on cognitive interviewing and pretesting methodology. The goal of the research is to get a better understanding of how often cognitive interviewing and other pretesting methods are used across survey research organizations, and to learn a bit about how approaches to cognitive interviewing differ across organizations. Thanks to my co-author and advisor, Stanley for his guidance in this research. So there are a number of textbooks and book chapters out there about cognitive interviewing and pretesting methods. One common conclusion in these resources is that more research is necessary on the implications of different interviewing approaches on the quality of the evaluation data. A handful of studies have compared different cognitive interviewing approaches, and they've generally concluded that methods do vary in their utility and in their impact on data quality. The overarching goal of my research is to better understand the implications of using different methods. And as a first step, I wanted to understand how much cognitive interviewing methods differ across organizations, as well as how often other pretesting methods are used across orgs. So Johnny Blair and my advisor, Stanley did similar research on cognitive interviewing back in 1993. So this research was designed in part to update their findings, which I'll share throughout the presentation. To address our research questions, we conducted a survey of survey research organizations in the US. We focused on two types of organizations, academic and non-academic, and we composed our sample using four lists. The first of which was the same list that Blair and Presser used when they did their survey back in 1992. And in 2020, I expanded the sample to also include the membership of ASRO, the FCSM, and the AAPOR Transparency Initiative. So our survey had 5 general topic areas. We wanted to collect data on how many cognitive interviews are typically conducted to test questions and who conducts the interviews. We wanted to get information about the guidelines for conducting interviews, as well as the guidelines for summarizing them and analyzing them. We wanted to collect data on the prevalence of other pretesting methods, and because we were fielding in 2020, like everybody else, we wanted to understand the impact of COVID-19 on our research topic. Okay, so we conducted a web survey on Qualtrics. The survey instrument had 45 questions, 8 of which were optional open-ended questions. The survey took place in the fall 2020. We received 49 responses, which led to a response rate of 37%. We found that among our respondents, 80% reported that they did pretesting in-house, and 57% reported using cognitive interviewing to pretest questions. And among the academic organizations, 65% reported using cognitive interviewing, which is higher than what was observed in 1993, where about a third of the academic organizations reported that they use cognitive interviews. Okay, on to the results, starting with how many cognitive interviews are conducted when pretesting a survey. We asked respondents to report the fewest and most number of cognitive interviews used to test a survey over the past few years. The number ranged from 1 to 335, or 80 if you exclude 3 organizations that reported more than 150 cognitive interviews to pretest a survey. You can see here that for federal agencies, they tend to conduct more interviews than the academic and commercial ones, whose max number of interviews are substantially lower. The orange dots here show the analogous results from 1993. For federal agencies, it looks as though the number of interviews has gone up since 1993, while for academic organizations, the number of interviews has perhaps gone down slightly. Okay, a little bit more about who conducts the interviews. The first table here shows the types of staff who conduct interviews, and the second table summarizes training requirements across organizations. Findings here were generally similar across organizations, so I've collapsed them for simplicity. No surprise that survey methodologists were the most common type of cognitive interviewer. Less common were students and interns, production interviewers, and survey subject matter experts. The 2020 findings suggest that the use of production interviewers has become less frequent than in 1993. The other types of staff mentioned were similar in 1993 and 2020, with one exception. In 1993, several academic organizations reported using psychologists as interviewers, while in 2020, no academic organizations reported using them. Just briefly on training, in 2020, 85% of the organizations required some training for cognitive interviewers, which is substantially higher than what was reported in 1993, which was about a third of the academic organizations required training. This slide shows the range of the number of interviewers used when pretesting the survey in 2020, with the orange dots showing 1993. In 2020, the number of interviewers ranged from 1 to 11, with the modal value for fewest interviewers being 1. Blair and Presser only reported on academic organizations. They found that the modal number of interviewers was 2, and that 90% of the organizations reported using between 2 and 7 interviewers. So the findings from 2020 suggest that perhaps fewer interviewers are being used during a given pretest, at least among the academic organizations. Okay, now we're turning to findings about how interviews are conducted. So this slide summarizes the use of protocols or written instructions while conducting interviews. Non-academic organizations were more likely to report that interviewers all used the same general protocol than the academic organizations. Academic organizations were more likely to report that interviewers developed their own protocol or test questions by following no protocol whatsoever. However, conducting interviews in this way was still fairly uncommon. No one reported doing it often. We also asked about the frequency of using think-aloud and probing techniques. You can see that probing methods are more common than using think-aloud instructions, although both methods are relatively popular. In 1993, 24% of the academic organizations reported using think-aloud methods, which is lower than what we saw in 2020. So that suggests that think-alouds may be becoming more popular. This slide goes into a little more detail about how think-alouds and probes are administered. So looking at the first row, 36% of organizations report sometimes or often only using the think-aloud method and not using any probes. So it seems like most of the time think-alouds are done in conjunction with probing. Different types of scripted probes are all relatively common, with the possible exception of scripted probes in reaction to respondent behavior. And not using any scripted probes, is relatively uncommon, although still reported by almost half of the organizations, which I think is interesting. So now we're turning to summarizing and analyzing cognitive interviews. This slide summarizes the frequency with which organizations report that they tape record their interviews. About half of the organizations report that interviews are recorded most of the time or always. Non-academic organizations were more likely than academic organizations to report the higher frequencies. In 1993, half of the academic organizations reported that they recorded interviews, compared to, I guess, about 70% here in 2020. So this suggests that the rate of recording among those types of organizations is going up. This table reports on a number of different aspects of summarizing and analyzing interviews. I'll touch on the highlights, but feel free to pause to read more carefully. Academic organizations were less likely than non-academic organizations to report transcribing interviews and to have someone other than the interviewer write up the interview findings. Although both types of organizations reported that it's typically the case that interviewers wrote up their own interview findings. Academic organizations were also less likely to report that the interviewer listens to the recording of the interview as they summarize it. The remaining behaviors are pretty consistent across organizations. Using multiple rounds of testing was very common, as was using other pretesting methods in conjunction with cog testing. Conducting interviews, cognitive interviews in a different mode than the actual survey was also fairly common, which I thought was surprising and interesting. The next two slides look at the prevalence of using different types of pretesting methods. Overall, the non-academic organizations tended to report using more these methods more frequently than the academic organizations. Among the academic organizations, focus groups were the most commonly reported lab method, while cognitive interviewing was the most common among the non-academic orgs. Web probing was slightly more common among non-academic organizations, but still used by about 30% of the academic organizations. So a sizable portion of organizations are getting rid of the interviewer while conducting these cognitive interviews, which I think is an interesting finding. So this table goes into the rates of using expert review, online resources, and methods that are typically embedded in a pilot test. Informal expert review by methodologists and subject matter experts were almost universal across all organizations, while using structured expert review methods like QAS were less common. SQP and QUAID were relatively uncommon, while measures of reading difficulty were somewhat more common. Methods embedded in pilot tests were all fairly common, some of which were reported more commonly than cognitive interviewing. So briefly, I'll touch on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on organizations' pretesting and cognitive interviewing practices. Surprisingly, over half the respondents reported that the pandemic had no impact on how they went about pretesting questionnaires. So I guess that's a good thing. The others reported, no surprise, that remote testing was replacing in-person testing. Very few reported that they're actually changing the actual type of pretesting method that they used. So that was good too. And then no surprise that the survey volume and complexity was reduced among a lot of organizations, and many reported delaying surveys or changing the mode of the survey to accommodate the circumstances. Okay, so now I'll move on to the conclusions, starting with changes that we observed since 1993. So relative to 93, it looks like there were more interviews conducted at federal agencies and fewer conducted at academic ones in 2020. Looks like fewer interviewers are used during pretests now than in 1993. Now there's also fewer production interviewers used, and as well as fewer psychologists used as interviewers. And at the same time, it looks like there's more training of interviewers going on nowadays and more recording of cognitive interviews than there were in the past. So a few other interesting findings from 2020. About 40% of the organizations reported that it's never the case that someone other than the interviewer summarizes their own interview. In other words, it's the interviewer that's conducting the interview and analyzing the findings quite frequently. So that's a lot of reliance on the interviewer to draw conclusions about how the questions are performing. Relatedly, interviewers almost always follow a protocol. Following a protocol was common overall, but a little bit less common among the academic organizations. And almost all of the organizations report using expert review before conducting cognitive interviews, and many also reported using some additional pretesting method in addition to those two methods. So here's some final thoughts on next steps. The findings in the survey suggest that some organizations rely heavily on the cognitive interviewer to not only execute the interview, but also summarize their own findings. So the impact of having just one person versus multiple people review the interviews is worth further examination. Conversely, removing the interviewer entirely is also growing in popularity. A lot of good research is underway on web probing methodology, which I hope to contribute to. I think there's less out there about the implications of testing over the phone or online when the respondent's nonverbal cues are less apparent. So establishing best practices under these circumstances is also important. One last thought, it's definitely the case that pretesting methods are fit for purpose and budget dependent. So it's not exactly useful to come up with guidelines to apply to everybody across the board. It'll be useful to dig deeper into what can be done, for example, on a small budget or short timeline, as well as based on specific goals of the pretest itself. So thanks again for tuning into my presentation. Special thanks to my survey respondents who provided a lot of additional feedback that I wasn't able to incorporate in this presentation. However, I certainly intend to reflect the feedback in future reports on this research. And if anyone has any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I'm happy to talk about this more. All right, thanks.